You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
There can be a tension, and sometimes there can be a misunderstanding of where we can help. And there's an ironic situation where you have colleagues sometimes who don't like to be told how to do their job, i.e. teach, because they are absolutely experts in their field. But sometimes they do need a bit of help, and sort of trying to find and tread the balance between acknowledging their absolute expertise and sort of saying, yes, what you're doing is really good, but we just want to enhance that. So that can be something to work on carefully, and that's where relationships are really important, and not always seeing a divide and kind of making sure that colleagues across the university kind of understand that they have a common goal.
Hello and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast from Times Higher Education that aims to offer insight and advice for best practice across all aspects of the global university sector. I'm Eliza Compton, Deputy Editor of Campus. But before we get into this episode, I'd like to take a quick moment to talk about a new podcast from our editorial team. News Talks goes behind the headlines to explore the biggest stories in higher education. It dovetails fortnightly with Campus Talks, and I urge you to tune in to hear Campus Editor Miranda Prynne in conversation with THE editors and journalists. The first 4 episodes are now live, with the latest asking if the recent review into Australian R&D will bring about hoped-for transformation. You'll find it under News Talks by Times Higher Education, wherever you listen to podcasts. And now on to our episode. Our topic today is the collaborative, integrated, traditionally hierarchical and sometimes tense relationship between academia and professional services. Each makes up about a half of the typical university workforce, but the former gets the lion's share of attention and prestige, while the latter can feel a pressure to prove their credibility and avoid being seen as harbingers of more work or university overreach. The fact is that each needs the other, and that professional services staff offer deep expertise, experience, networks and support that keep universities on track to excellence, spanning functions as diverse as libraries, estates, IT, HR, admissions, student wellbeing and learning development, and many others. My interview is with an expert professional services educator. Eleanor Hodgson is a Senior Educator Developer and Director of the Aspire Professional Recognition Pathway in the Educator Development Team at the University of Exeter. Eleanor has held both academic and professional services roles, working as Evaluation Specialist for the Collaborative Outreach Consortium New Steps Southwest, as well as Accreditation and Rankings Officer at Exeter's Business School, before taking on her current position in 2021. She has a PhD in French from the University of Sheffield and as a lecturer specialised in French rap and hip-hop, medieval literature and French language teaching. With a passion for education practice and experience on both sides of the fence, she's well qualified to answer questions such as, how deep is the divide between academic and professional services staff? Does the sector do enough to support career pathways for staff who don't fit the neat progression of traditional academia? And how can universities do more to ensure that the breadth and depth of professional services expertise is not overlooked? Eleanor talks about how her team in educator development collaborates with academics to enhance teaching and develop expertise such as AI literacy and inclusive pedagogy, and also with other professional services teams across the university. She also lays out the challenges to promotion, progression and recognition for professional services staff. So let's hear from Eleanor. Hi Eleanor, and welcome to the Campus Talks podcast.
Hi Eliza, nice to be here.
To start off, I wanted to ask you about your role as the Senior Educator Developer at the University of Exeter.
So I'm part of a team who sit centrally within the university. We used to actually be called the Academic Development Team, and that's probably a more familiar terminology, although some other universities use terms like educational developers. But essentially, we sit in the middle of the university to support education practice and academic practice across all disciplines and also across professional services educators' roles. So we run, for example, our learning and teaching in higher education pathway. My colleague Craig McEwen directs that, which primarily supports early career educators who are postgraduate teaching assistants kind of taking their first steps. But we also look after perhaps colleagues in kind of professional services roles like in libraries or in careers teams to also learn and develop their pedagogic practice. So we do that kind of formal pathway to developing as an educator. But alongside that, we also run sort of ad hoc and bespoke continuing professional development for academics and educators in the broad sense, which is why we've ended up developing our name, changing our name to become Educator Development, because we want to make sure that any education interaction at the university is effective and supportive for any learner, whether they're an undergraduate, postgraduate, or also staff and colleagues who are learning and developing. So we'll run CPD sessions, for example, on assessment, looking a lot in the past couple of years around AI and the impact of generative AI on assessment and helping colleagues to rethink their assessment practice. We've run sessions on writing inclusive feedback. We have particular specialities within our team. So my colleague Rachel Griffiths looks after inclusive education and supports colleagues at the moment with universal design for learning. And then alongside that, my area of responsibility particularly is looking after our university's experiential route to advanced HE fellowships, which sits alongside kind of our taught route, so the LTHE programme, and also there's an academic professional programme that our School of Education runs, which is accredited. We help them to think about who they are as an educator and how they can evidence their effective and inclusive practice across the different dimensions of the professional standards framework and at different descriptors depending on where they are with their experience. So basically, I spend my days talking to educators and learning about what they do. And if you're a passionate educator yourself, I'm meeting people all the time and learning about different ways they're teaching, the challenges they face, and how they overcome them. So it's a really interesting role. Like I'm learning about learning day in, day out.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it, and sounds like you get into all aspects of the university. So it must be fascinating.
Yes, it really is. One of the things that we're quite keen to do is to leverage the position that we have of sort of knowing people, forming relationships with colleagues in academic disciplines and connecting people up and then linking that up to sort of strategic projects within the university. So our team head, Kelly Louise Priest, does a great job representing us and kind of being in more senior leadership positions if the university is kind of steering towards, for example, policies and guidance around the use of generative AI. She's part of those conversations and we can kind of report back what we see on the ground, helping staff to develop, and then how that translates into policy, and then how then that feeds back as well. So there's this kind of cyclical nature of what we do to shape the university's education landscape and then to help people to develop their practice at the same time as well.
Absolutely. I have been doing a bit of reading about what professional services do. And one of the things that has come through is this connective tissue aspect of it. Now, you have come at this role from both sides, as it were. You are an academic as well as the work that you've done in professional services. How did you come to be in this role?
That's a very good question. I would partly say by chance, but I think having been in the role 4.5, nearly 5 years, I think, I don't know, maybe it was destiny. Fundamentally, I am an educator. So my background is in languages. Throughout my PhD, as many PhD students do, I was teaching as a postgraduate teaching assistant and found that languages teaching particularly, but just teaching in general was my passion, almost more than research. So having done that, I then taught in schools and became a qualified teacher, which I really loved, but I missed the higher education setting. So I kind of went back as a lecturer, but was always interested in seeing the university kind of in the round. So I took different opportunities to sort of step out of academic roles, worked in professional services in kind of a project-based role in widening participation, then missed teaching. So I've kind of flitted depending on really where my pull is. And this role came up and I read it and I kind of thought, that's me to a T. I can become an educator who educates people about education. So the sort of disciplinary knowledge that I have, yes, it's drawn on my own experiences teaching a discipline, languages, but actually it's drawn on who I am as an educator kind of more broadly. And as I started the role, I realized that it was a space where I could shed worries about an academic discipline and really focus on the core purpose, I think, of an educator, which is helping people to learn. And you kind of get this two-step effect because obviously I have learners, i.e. the staff that I support and I look after, but they have learners. So you have this really great opportunity to influence what could be happening across a really wide scale in an institution without having to go and teach every single student in the institution. So it was that kind of partly chance, partly moving between different things and finding things that were interesting. But it wasn't a job I ever really knew existed. And I think this concept of when you explain to people that we don't have always like really rigorous training for teaching, you do learn on the job. We've got much better at it, and there's some great programs at ensuring our lecturers are qualified and know what they're doing, but that hasn't always been the case. So this isn't something that I knew existed, but when I found it, it felt like the right place to be.
That's really interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit, perhaps based on your experience and the interactions that you have with colleagues, how this relationship between the academic and the non-academic staff has evolved?
So I think there's perhaps was historically a myth that if you have a PhD and sort of loads of knowledge in a topic, then you'll also be a brilliant person at teaching that to other people, which can be true, but teaching is also a skill, and effective teaching and inclusive teaching actually is something you do need to spend time thinking about and talking to other people about and developing. And I think sometimes there can be a bit of a divide between an academic who's really deeply rooted in research and subject knowledge in their discipline, and maybe a more kind of central professional, often professional services colleague, such as myself, who's sort of seen as a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. You know, you know about teaching in the round, but what do you know about a specific thing? And sometimes there can be a divide and almost an assumption that if you work in a professional services role, you're perhaps a slightly lesser colleague, or you're not as informed, or you don't have as much credibility. And that can sometimes cause tensions, or implicitly or explicitly make you feel as a professional services educator that you have to kind of state your credentials wherever you go, whether that's many people in professional services have PhDs, not all of them do, and I don't think everyone ought to either, because that's not an expectation, but often we do have really deep subject knowledge, either demonstrated through a PhD or just through absolutely years of experience in our own roles. So we don't have a qualification to go alongside it, but we are experts in our discipline of higher education, if you like. And sometimes you feel like you have to flaunt that wherever you go in order to get people to listen to you sometimes. But I think there can also be sometimes a feeling that we represent the university. So if, for example, we're helping to roll out a new system or a new curriculum model, or things that are inherently going to ask our academic colleagues to do things differently or to do things more, we can be a bit of a scapegoat of, you know, you're the harbours of bad news, or don't tell me how to do things. I haven't got time for this. So there can be a tension, and sometimes there can be a misunderstanding of where we can help. And there's an ironic situation where you have colleagues sometimes who don't like to be told how to do their job, i.e., teach, because they are absolutely experts in their field. But sometimes they do need a bit of help, and sort of trying to find and tread the balance between acknowledging their absolute expertise and sort of saying, yes, what you're doing is really good, but we just want to enhance that. So that can be something to work on carefully. And that's where relationships are really important, and not always seeing a divide, and kind of making sure that colleagues across the university kind of understand that they have a common goal, which is to support and enhance education practice, and that actually it's not about dividing into different services, although yes, those divisions on paper need to exist, but that we are a community who are there to support our learners, and actually collaborating and integrating our knowledge, our expertise, our skills, and bringing us together can be really beneficial for the students that we're ultimately here to look after and help learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, it is all about effective teaching, best practice teaching. And I imagine that the support that your colleagues and yourself provide comes in a few different forms. So, is it the academics or the teaching staff coming to you? How do these connections happen?
So it depends, I guess, on the context. I think a lot of it at its heart is contingent on relationships that you build. So sometimes you are parachuted in. So, for example, learning designers, learning developers will be sort of assigned to maybe the new development of a course, particularly online programs, for example, because they have the technical knowledge. So they are assigned and you're told as an academic, you're going to be working with this professional services colleague. They're going to help you do this thing better. And sometimes similarly, we are, in our team, we're kind of parachuted in, although we don't really like that rhetoric to sort of save a department that's maybe not doing so well in a certain area. That's something we try to avoid, because that can automatically make people feel like they're under attack or they're coming to be told off. So we would much prefer it if it's the other way around, which it also is, where colleagues come to us. So, for example, through the work that I do, looking after our professional recognition pathway, I get to know colleagues, I get to learn about their practice, and I always look for opportunities. In fact, just before this call, talking to somebody about their application, making a note of, oh, that sounds really interesting. Can I follow up with you about that? I'd really like to learn more about that practice, finding out where good practice is, and then encouraging people to come to us to share that so we can share it with others, or sort of saying it'd be really good to unpick that a bit more and see if maybe there's some way we can enhance that. So acknowledging what people are doing already and seeing how we can either share that with other people, celebrate it with other people, or enhance it is generally a more effective model than going into a department and saying, you're doing really badly, we've come to tell you how to do your job. So it depends on context, but I think the most beneficial opportunities are those where there is a real kind of mutual understanding and we're going to work on this together, rather than seeing us as a remedial service. And I think that's the same thing as well if you look at other educators in professional services roles that are student facing. So library, study skills, technicians, careers teams, entrepreneurship teams, student support and wellbeing, for example, that academic colleagues understand and appreciate their knowledge and skills and expertise, and try and integrate that within their teaching, within their student cohorts, rather than sort of, again, creating that divide or perpetuating that divide in the student body as well. So sort of saying, we've got colleagues here and they are also part of your learning experience. We've got the skills team in today, or we've got the careers team in today. So I think as much as possible, making those collaborations really integrated is the most effective way, rather than a bolt-on or a remedial thing.
That makes complete sense. I wanted to talk to you a bit about then professional pathways, one of the aspects of your job, being Director of Aspire at Exeter. Do you think there is enough visibility and opportunity for professional development for professional services staff?
I think there's a will for it to be, but I think in reality it can fall behind. And I think that's for two reasons. One, that we don't have the same promotion and progression pathways as academic colleagues. So it's harder to then ring fence and find time to do professional development, because whilst we do have professional development conversations and PDRs and those things, the same routes and putting yourself forward for promotion like an academic would isn't an opportunity for us. So we don't necessarily prioritize doing that. We feel sometimes quite bounded within our role. It might be that those opportunities to become a real kind of expert in your field and be recognized for that, and feel like you're still progressing without just moving into a managerial position, is harder. So people maybe don't sort of prioritize something that they don't see the benefit of in terms of their next steps. I also think that whilst there's a will, sometimes people don't feel confident to come and kind of articulate their practice in that way. And a lot of the practice that I've been trying to do, and picking up on the people who were running the scheme before me and colleagues kind of around me, it's not just me, is to really remind colleagues who are educators in professional services roles, or sort of third space academics, if you like, that they are just as valuable and just as knowledgeable as educators as their academic peers, and trying to kind of promote that sense of community and acknowledge and recognise who they are and what they do, so that they then feel more inclined to prioritise their own professional development. So looking for opportunities to bring them together, to celebrate what they do. If we run, for example, like a festival on education practice, making sure that we've got professional services colleagues represented on the agenda. Same thing with you might be in a task and finish group for something and kind of working out, well, actually, have you asked this colleague in that team rather than just sitting in the room with academics? So it's not always easy. I think there is a will to do so, but there are certain things that make it more difficult. And I think the lack of professionalization, ironically, of being professional services and seeing a kind of progression and promotion opportunities across the sector widely. This special issue that I, with colleagues, co-edited around the third space, this was a theme that came up time and time again, that the sector doesn't know how to promote and support the progression of third space academics or professional services educators, because we don't fit those neat pathways of lecturer, senior lecturer, etc. Some universities kind of get around it by putting colleagues such as myself into an academic role, but that doesn't fix the problem. You've just moved us somewhere else. So I think it's about how do we still, I'm really proud to be professional services. I don't want to be an academic again, I don't think. But I would still like to have the same opportunities that I think sometimes if I were still an academic, would I be senior lecturer by now? Would I have those opportunities that I don't have? It can cause us also to look for jumping ship into a different service or feeling like we're hitting a dead end. And that can be quite challenging personally, but also for the teams around us as well. So you can sometimes feel a bit blocked. We're aware of it. We just don't think we've solved how to sort it yet.
Mm-hmm. Is there more that the university could be doing? I mean, Exeter sounds like they're doing an awful lot in this regard. So it's a more general question than specifically focused on one institution.
I think really considering what a career as a professional services educator looks like would help, and being able to not make us inherently feel like we're second class academics because we don't have the same opportunities as an academic. So thinking about that, promotion and progression structure and articulating that clearly so that without feeling like you have to either become or go back to being an academic, because a lot of colleagues that I work with have at some point been on the other side, if you like, but still feeling like you're mirroring those opportunities that your academic colleagues have so that you can be, so I have the word senior against my name, but I don't really know that that means as much as in an academic context. And there's no associate professor version of me unless I take on a managerial role, which is not necessarily the same if I were in an associate professor context or as an advanced teaching practitioner kind of role. So I think having more formal pathways would be good. But I think the other thing, and this is talking with my colleague Craig, actually, he was highlighting when I had this conversation with him, that looking for opportunities to really embed what we do know and celebrate and seeing and kind of valuing the knowledge that we bring and not overlooking us. So to give an example, particularly at our institution, there's a lot of focus at the moment, and I know this is sector-wide, around skills, employability, graduate skills, academic skills, and preparedness. And we've got colleagues in lots of different professional services teams who are experts in those fields. A colleague in our own team, Kate, has a doctorate in skills, and yet sometimes we see work developing where we have to kind of ask to be involved, whereas it would be really nice that we are part of that invitation from the beginning. So sort of saying, we know that, I guess to come back to your question more coherently, to make sure that universities are really clear on the skills and the knowledge and the expertise that they have in their professional services teams to draw on, and that they deliberately draw on those as much as they would their academic colleagues, so that from the start they can sort of say, we need a bunch of experts to discuss XYZ topic. We know we've got a pool of people who we can draw from across the university rather than just prioritizing or overlooking those professional services colleagues. And I think if that could then be tied up with a way that would help us to have then somewhere to go in terms of progression and promotion, that would also be great. But even in the short term, just feeling like we're valued and people want us to be there, rather than sometimes having to muscle in and finding out a conversation is happening and you think, well, I could have helped, or so and so could have really helped to that. I think that would alleviate a lot of the frustration and help us feel like we are as important as our academic colleagues are.
Mm. I'm aware that we are running down the clock. I wanted to ask you, what's on your plate at the moment? What are you actually working on?
So, as a team, we are working quite a lot across the university and in collaboration with other professional services teams to support the university in doing a few strategic projects, one of which is a new curriculum model that's being developed, and the other of which is really sort of enhancing our student experience. So we're spending time getting to know departmental priorities, collaborating, for example, learning developers who look after our virtual learning environment, working alongside them to ensure that guidance for staff in how to design their online learning environments is effective and inclusive, making sure that we're all singing off of the same hymn sheet. So there's a lot of time we're spending at the moment at hearing on the ground what's happening in departmental level, taking that back and then reviewing the guidance that we provide. So although we do quite a lot of CPD, as I mentioned, kind of workshops, we also look after an education toolkit, which is a sort of a one-stop shop for colleagues across the university to come to for guidance on practice. So we're enhancing that in response to what we're seeing on the ground. On a personal note, I'm also making the most of the relationships that I formed with colleagues across the university by embedding myself into various bits of teaching. So I'm actually off on a field trip next week with a geography module because they needed a French speaker and they're actually working on a topic that I know something about. So that's quite nice. I'll be helping to assess on that module, and then I can feed that into some work that we're doing about innovative forms of assessment. So we're sort of looking for opportunities to get out and practice what we're preaching and then feed that back in so that the support and the guidance we give to colleagues is relevant, is up to date. I think that's one of the really important things as well. We are educators ourselves. We shouldn't be seen as just kind of trainers. And to go back to my point about having credibility and feeling like sometimes you need to prove your credibility, I think it's really important that professional services educators are allowed to educate, and that we're allowed to teach undergraduates or postgraduates, that we're recognised as educators and given those opportunities so that we also keep our professional development in our own practice. So I'm doing everything I can to get my fingers in many pies and help out and feed that back, but also to develop my own teaching practice too.
Well, for someone who has a passion for education, this must be absolutely essential. Just a final question for you, Eleanor. This has been such a great conversation. If you could give some advice to your younger self about finding a fulfilling, meaningful place in the university, I'm going to presume that you started off with a thinking that you would work in the higher education sector, presumably as an academic, but
Yeah.
what would you tell your freshly minted PhD self?
It's a great question. I think, first of all, be really open to what your career could be. And I think you're right. Yeah, I did my PhD presuming I'd become an academic and seeing a model that, my PhD supervisor had finished a PhD and immediately got a lectureship. But the sector's so different now to how it was before. And I think I felt for a while that I had in some way failed by not becoming an academic in inverted commas, even though I was for a little while. It was always often fixed term posts and stuff. So be a bit more open and kinder to myself and my expectations, and be more malleable with where that takes you, and look for opportunities to have a broad understanding of what education looks like so that you don't perpetuate this expectation that only academics are real educators. And I really, really don't want people to think that, which is one of the great things about when we teach our PhD students on our learning and teaching and higher education courses, saying we are educators too, but we're also professional services, so that that stereotype doesn't perpetuate. I think the other thing I would say, and I was talking to my colleague Craig about this, so this is as much his advice as it is mine. You need to be able to create your own career path and look for opportunities to do that. Sometimes they will fall on you without you realizing. Sometimes you'll have to be a bit thoughtful in finding your next step. But what should guide you is kind of what your values are as an educator, as a person, as an academic, and use that to decide what you say yes to or no to, or what you look for, and not being afraid if you feel like the door isn't open to sort of push at the door and ask for those opportunities, and be more confident in articulating the value that you can add. And I think for me, coming into this role, I wasn't sure that I could confidently talk to everybody about education practice. I knew I was a good educator in my discipline, but I didn't necessarily feel like I could, shape what someone was doing in physics or engineering. But the more I've done it, the more I've realised that actually the core values of being a good educator are the same. And what you can do is understand what those are, understand how they chime with who you are, and then listen to people to help them fit their own context into your knowledge or vice versa. So I would say to my younger self, look for opportunities and be confident, because you're adding as much value as you thought you might. Being a medieval French lecturer, you're possibly adding more value because your reach is broader, and that is just as important as kind of training the next generation of scholars in a field. You're still supporting education practice, and that's basically what you wanted to do to begin with. So it's really good you're still doing it now.
Well, you definitely sound like you're in the right place. Sharing your expertise and enriching the education experience, as you say, in a much broader way than it possibly would have been if you had stuck to French medieval literature, wonderful though that is. Eleanor, thank you so much for your insights and thoughts on professional services in teaching and learning today. It's been a really great conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
What really came out of this conversation for me was the wisdom of developing a central repository of teaching expertise, one that is not siloed but shared across the institution and is able to cross-pollinate practices such as inclusive pedagogy. The nature of Eleanor's role puts her in touch with new ideas and approaches which can then be enhanced, shared and celebrated. The university is, after all, a community with a common goal of supporting learners and creating knowledge. And as Eleanor points out, this should be recognised with clear career pathways that encourage and make visible opportunities for progression to senior roles, in the same way that academic staff can chart their professional development. Her experience too, that she found her role almost by chance, seems like a good argument for making professional services a visible, recognised and respected pathway. The takeaway for universities then seems to be to look for ways to make maximum use of the extraordinary expertise in professional services and to involve these experts at the start of conversations rather than looking at them as an add-on or a remedial fix. If you're at the beginning of your academic journey, wondering where you might fit into the university system, this conversation has also shown that it's worth exploring the array of non-academic and third space roles that underpin, support and advance education practice, or indeed any other aspect of the university. Ask questions, find out what is possible, push on doors that might initially seem closed, and be open to opportunities that might not replicate the classic academic career path, but will be indeed meaningful and valuable. As Eleanor says, you might in fact be adding more value because your reach is broader than a single subject area. So that brings us to the end of this episode. I want to thank my guest, Eleanor Hodgson from the University of Exeter, for her time and insight. If you would like more advice around working with professional services, you'll find articles from experts from around the world in our latest Spotlight Guide on campus. Just go to timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, like, comment and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.